We're live.
We are back in Senate Judiciary, April 30th. We've got S329, draft 1.1, and we have led counsel here to remind us of what we shall do.
Good morning, everybody. Eric Fitzpatrick with the Office of Legislative Counsel. Here, as the chair indicated, to talk to the committee a little bit about a proposed possible amendment to S329, activating to criminal procedures involving firearms. Does everybody have a highlighted version?
Yep.
Looks like 1.1.
Could I grab another?
427.
Do you have another copy in there? Let's do. Thank you, sir.
And before I go through that, or to sort of mention, the highlights show what the changes were that the committee had talked about making. But also, you'll see there were some issues that I think were resolved. And so there's some highlight language that sort of directs the committee to an issue that you were thinking about, but hadn't reached the final decision on. So not necessarily the highlights indicate some change in language. It might just be pointing out. I just think it's so big. So with that in mind, the first highlight though actually is the committee talked about striking section 1, the grand larceny piece, and that was the language that provided that when a firearm is the piece of property that's stolen, that the $900 threshold between a misdemeanor and a felony doesn't apply. That if it's a firearm that's stolen, then it would always be a felony. I think the committee discussed that and came to the conclusion that wasn't a policy that you were in favor of. So the language you have now just strikes that section. Section 2. Now this is also a penalty increase. Remember, this is the language that involves people who have been convicted of violent crimes. Right now, if you've been convicted of a violent crime that's in the statutory list, and you possess a firearm, that's prohibited, and it's a misdemeanor, 2-year misdemeanor always. First offense, second offense, third offense, always a 2-year misdemeanor. But the proposal that's came in the House was to make the second and subsequent offenses a 3-year felony. So that's the language that you see on page 2, lines 8 and 9 underlined. Maybe we're still talking about that. And in particular, you were talking about it if you look over on page 5 in the context of the definition of violent felonies. And you may recall that the committee was particularly concerned about how drug offenses do count as violent felonies. Sometimes, depending on the nature of the drug offense. You see in the language highlighted on page 5, certain regulated drugs, marijuana not being one of them, cocaine, heroin, LSD, hallucinogens, etc., selling, dispensing, or trafficking those does count as a violent felony for purposes of being prohibited from owning a firearm. So I came up with this chart that I think might help the committee think about that a little bit, because I think you were wondering, well, does that make sense given what the penalties are? It's interesting, you'll see when we take a look at it, that the penalties for selling and penalties for selling and dispensing, the way the statute is phrased, they're not broken out. So selling or dispensing are both included. And you'll see they are gradations of penalty that depend on the amount of the substance that's sold or dispensed. So just taking the first one as an example, cocaine, selling or dispensing 2.5 grams, it's 10-year felony, but selling or dispensing an ounce or more is a 20-year felony. Trafficking involves much more significant amounts of the substance, 150 grams of cocaine content. And I think this is the issue that the committee was particularly concerned about was the fact that giving away, for example, there's a Vermont State Supreme Court case right on point called State v. Francis that says specifically that handing a lit joint to another person does constitute giving away within the definition of dispensing. So that's your background. That's the understanding of it. Now, whether or not you want to either include this section and make the penalty more enhanced for subsequent offenses, that may inform your thinking on that, or whether or not you want to do something different, like, for example, take the existing language on page 5 and just strike the word dispensing in each case. You could do that so that it's still counted as a felony for firearms purposes if you sold or trafficked, but not dispensed. So,
Did you say you could hand somebody a joint?
correct.
Would that wouldn't trigger a police notice?
It would. It would, because the word dispensing in particular is what is interpreted by
But
this.
isn't it selling or dispensing?
Sorry, in the marijuana context. You're right. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking
Yeah.
drugs generally. You're right. No, marijuana is excluded completely.
Right.
So, no, that wouldn't count. It would
Right.
have to be one of the other.
And it has to be so many times an unlawful dosage. So, for hallucinogenic drugs, the lowest bar is 10 or more doses, 2 grams, 100 times a benchmark. So it's not, in none of these cases, I don't think, is it giving somebody one dose of something. It's multiples of that unlawful dose.
Yes, the way I read the amounts that are.
So it's hard to say that a person who is sitting next to somebody and offers them a single dose of any of these drugs, they will not fall under this rule.
Correct.
Okay, great.
Senator Hudson.
I'm good, actually.
All right.
Okay.
And if I could just, my reasoning for keeping this enhanced penalty is that, and I know I said this before the other day, but, so they've already been convicted. That to me is the first, then they would have to be, found guilty of possessing a firearm after that. Then they would have to be guilty of possessing a firearm after that a second time. So it would be their third offense, second offense after conviction of the violent crime. So it seems to me there's a real pattern of breaking the law there, which is why I can support the felony addition here. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Okay. And
So
this
really-
this lasts forever though, right? I mean, so if you're, say you're in your 20s, sell coke and you've got a gun, you get arrested for selling coke, you get arrested later on for having a gun. Do a little bit of time or on probation for a while, whatever it is. 30 years later, you possess a firearm, you're on the hook for this.
Yeah, that's permanent. Yeah, if I should get it expunged or something, but yeah. One of your prizes.
And so you would already have the felony on your record though, so you would be prohibited from having a firearm to begin with.
Right. So we're not changing that.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
So my concern is similar to yours, and comes back to the dispensing. So this could be an instance where someone was in their 20s, they went to a party and they brought the ecstasy for their friends, gave it to them. 30 years later, they don't know they're not supposed to have a firearm. They have one, they get picked up, they're like, oh, you have this violent felony, which wasn't actually ever violent. You can't have this firearm. Say another 10 years passes and now they're on the hook for the felony.
they do have to get arrested the first time after the possession or the selling.
The party, well, they didn't sell, they brought the ecstasy to party for their
With
friend.
gold or defense. And then they also have to get arrested either at the same time or subsequently for having a firearm.
And then again,
Well, so it could actually happen theoretically that they were charged with just giving ecstasy to their friends and possessing a firearm. Is that the initial firearm offense? So then 30 years later, they're picked up for a felony that they don't, and they didn't even know they weren't supposed to have a firearm?
well, I think it's hard to make the argument that somebody's going to be innocent in all these cases. Because, yeah, maybe they gave, in your example, the ecstasy to their friends, they're convicted, and then they're convicted of that violent crime. Then they would have to get, in your example, let's say it's 20 years later, they get picked up for that. They get charged with misdemeanor, then they have to get picked up again and charged with a felony. So it's the felony, it's hard to see how anybody could not know at that point that they're breaking the law.
After the first time of being arrested, as a prohibited person being charged with a misdemeanor, convicted of a misdemeanor, because you're a prohibited person, you would probably know it that
Pretty much.
Yeah, I think my issue really comes back to giving ecstasy to my friends at a party in college is not a violent crime.
Well, I mean,
I don't know that they should have been prohibited in the first place. They didn't commit a violent crime.
and I think, you know, in this list, we could get into the depths of our criminal statutes, and how they go into drug, prejudice against drug events or crimes. But it seems like what this bill is doing is relatively simple. It's saying if you have a pattern of violating that prohibition against that firearm, there needs to be a stronger penalty at the end. So,
And I think I would feel more supportive if we struck dispensing from what constitutes a violent crime for the purposes of someone having.
then are we striking it in both cases?
I think in any it's not, it's already not applicable. Wait, is it applicable to the misdemeanor, the first offense already?
Yes,
Okay, dispensing is,
correct.
Yeah.
I don't wanna, in this bill, I don't wanna weaken what we're doing on the first offense. And I do support the higher penalty for the second.
I think what I'm saying is that by striking dispensing, that is no longer a reason that we would be prohibited from having a firearm.
Yeah, I oppose that. That's what I'm saying.
any other thoughts?
I'm fine leaving it.
Well, we're moving.
All right, so we'll leave it.
All right, so moving on to section 2, start to the bottom of page 5 over on the page 6 and 7. This is a similar issue in the sense that it's about prohibited persons. So but in this section, we're not talking about people being prohibited from possessing firearms because of their criminal conviction history. It's about other categories, and in particular, the change proposed here has to do with the person's mental health history. And it's really just a tweak to the language here that you may recall I mentioned to the committee that the Department of Health had some concerns about how the language had been written previously. And so it's
Which page in line here?
page 6 and 7. Starts on line 13 and goes through the top of page 7. So it doesn't change the concept at all. It's more of a focusing of the language on who it is that actually would be prohibited from possessing a firearm under the concept that, as we've talked about before, these folks are already prohibited under federal law from possessing firearms. So this is a smaller carve out of the folks that are prohibited by federal law already. And in particular, you'll see that line 14 adds it's not just that the court has found you to be a person in need of treatment, which means danger to yourself or others as a result of mental illness. But the way the existing Vermont reporting statute works and the criminal procedure statute works, the court could also find that you were a patient in need of further treatment. So this just, the Department of Mental Health pointed out that we would want to add that there as well, so that that's inclusive of either one of those findings the court could make after this person was found either not guilty by reason of insanity or incompetent to stand trial. So that's that first piece. The second language change, which is bottom of page 6 over on the top of page 7, it's make it clear that I think an inadvertent consequence of the way the language had been written was that, for example, top of page 7, if you establish a committed order for a non-violent crime, then you would be prohibited. If you were the subject of a committed order for a violent crime, you would be. So you could have the firearm. It was found that by the court that you were incompetent to stand trial for a non-violent crime, but not a violent one. It was not in that. So the language is clarified. You see bottom of page 5. Sorry, page 6. That the incompetency finding paralleling the NGRI one is that it has to be for a violent. Well, that's the way that language is chewed up. So the, skip it up for a second here. Section. Yes, so just for a moment. Well, we'll get to that. This topic was sometimes. Keep an eye on the clock here. So let's talk for a moment first then about the waiting period on page 8. This, remember, is the concept that if the firearm is transferred by mail, then the 72-hour waiting period starts when the order is placed, rather than when the firearm is picked up at the FFL. Because someone orders it by mail, they pick it up at the FFL. The way it works right now, the 72-hour waiting period clock starts when they pick it up. So the proposal is if someone orders it through the mail, then the waiting period can start at the time the order is placed. So the language that you see, the second sentence in particular, mirrors the language that Vermont has in statute for retailers selling alcohol and tobacco products, that kind of thing. That language says, for example, I'll read you the one for tobacco. The person failed to provide proper proof of age, the licensee shall be entitled to refuse to sell tobacco products or private paraphernalia to the person. So it's the same language.
Were you able to talk to an FFL or look at the federal guidelines for mailing firearms by any chance?
I didn't talk to an FFL, but I did look at some of the federal guidelines, and there are some situations, for example, generally speaking, it has to be mailed to an FFL as opposed to mailed person to person. There are some exceptions to that, but that's generally true. It's also especially true. It's always true if it's ordered across the state lines. So across the state lines, it has to be picked up at an FFL.
And every time a firearm is shipped through the mail, though, does there have to be tracking number and detailed shipping information? I struggle to believe that the feds would allow you to just throw a gun in a box and put some postage on it and ship it off.
Right. Well, handgun can't be mailed at all, person to person. So this would only apply to long guns. For example, I looked at the U.S. Postal Service regulations. They do require the tracking information that you just talked about is in the Postal Service regs. But someone might use, I don't know, UPS or FedEx to mail it from one FFL to another. Presumably, they were able to find a specific regs. Maybe something similar would apply. But it does allow the FFL to look at the receipt. They have that receipt, and then they can make a decision as to whether or not they think the receipt satisfactorily indicates the purchase of mailing gifts.
I know we're running short. There's a bit more I want to hash out on this. We'll get to that. Senator Bruce, and then we'll wrap up.
And I'll just say, after thinking about it quite a lot,
yeah,
I could support this. If on line 14, instead of saying the dealer shall be entitled to refuse, if it said the dealer shall refuse. So the sentence already gives the dealer some discretion when whether it's satisfactory.
Mm-hmm.
But that second clause sort of gives them like to decide on whatever they want. So they will be entitled to refuse or not refuse. So I would get rid of be entitled to and have it just say the dealer shall refuse if it's not satisfactorily indicating the date.
Right.
And I do have to go to the floor.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we all do. So, okay. Thank you, Eric.
Yeah.